You ever stumble across something so ridiculously cheap that you assume it's either a scam or haunted? That's exactly what happened when I found this cabin online. There it was, a tiny, peeling shack in the middle of nowhere listed for 50 cents. 50 cents? I clicked on the listing twice, expecting the website to crash or tell me I'd misread it. But no, the price was real. I laughed out loud in my living room, half in disbelief, half in excitement. I don't know what possessed me, but I knew I had to have it. Maybe it was the thrill of owning property for less than the price of a venti latte. Maybe it was the part of me that secretly dreams about living off the grid and yelling at squirrels. Either way, I went for it. I filled out the forms, paid the 50 cents, and just like that, my cabin was mine. The drive out there the first time was a mix of exhilaration and creeping unease. Google Maps warned me route may be impassable. I ignored it, and honestly, that was probably a mistake. The road was a narrow dirt path that wound through trees like something out of a horror movie. Every bump made me tense, imagining the cabin collapsing before I even saw it. Finally, I reached the clearing, and there it was, smaller and shabbier than I'd imagined. Paint peeling, windows fogged, a roof that looked like it had lost a fight with a tornado, but somehow it had character, and in that moment it was perfect. I stepped out, stretching my legs, and the smell hit me, wet wood, moss, and a hint of mildew. Charming, right? I took the key, turned the rusty lock, and pushed the door open. The cabin groaned in protest, dust motes dancing in the sunlight that managed to sneak through the dirty windows. I tiptoed in, half expecting a ghost, or at least a raccoon, to greet me. Silence, too silent. The inside was tiny, maybe 3 rooms, all sagging slightly, but I could see the potential. I imagined cozy nights by a fire, a little hammock on the porch, maybe even hosting friends for the occasional barbecue. Of course, reality hit hard the moment I tried to walk across the creaky floor. One step and it felt like the floorboards were auditioning for a horror film. But hey, that's minor compared to owning something for 50 cents, right? I spent the rest of the day exploring, poking into closets, opening cabinets that seemed to have been untouched for decades. In one corner, I found an old, dusty notebook with faded handwriting. I flipped through it, half expecting some secret map to buried treasure, but it was just mundane stuff, lists of chores, notes about deliveries, and occasional complaints about neighbors. Still, it felt oddly personal, like I'd just uncovered a small piece of history. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest around me went quiet, but not the peaceful kind. The kind of quiet that makes you question whether you're alone. The wind whistled through cracks in the walls, and the cabin groaned as if settling itself or warning me. I laughed nervously and told myself I was overreacting. Spiders aren't ghosts, floorboards aren't evil, but still I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I settled into the rickety chair I found in the corner, my excitement was mixed with unease. This was the start of something new, something thrilling, but I had no idea how complicated it would get. I thought owning a 50-cent cabin would be simple. Turns out, I was about to find out that even the cheapest properties can come with the most expensive headaches. And just as I was about to drift off to sleep, imagining cozy mornings and maybe a lake view someday, I noticed something strange. A light flickering in the distance, through the trees, moving slowly toward the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe it was an animal, or maybe, just maybe, someone else was already keeping an eye on my little 50-cent treasure. And that's when I realized buying the cheapest cabin in the country might have been the easiest part of this story. The hard part, the terrifying, hilarious, unbelievable part, was about to begin. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through grimy windows and the smell of wet wood. I'd spent the night half imagining all sorts of scenarios. Maybe raccoons had plotted a midnight meeting in the attic, or the wind had formed some kind of conspiracy against me, but nothing had happened. I laughed nervously, telling myself I was being dramatic. After all, it's just a cabin. How scary could it really be? I started exploring more thoroughly, trying to picture what I could do with the place. A fresh coat of paint, some new furniture, maybe even a small garden, it could become something incredible. And that's when I noticed it, a piece of paper tucked under the door. At first, I thought it was a grocery list or a note from a neighbor. Then I saw the header, Notice of Housing Violation. I froze. Housing violation? I hadn't even unpacked a single box. The letter was formal, intimidating, and threatening. Apparently, I was in violation of some rules that I had literally never heard of regarding property boundaries, mailbox placement, and get this, exterior paint consistency with neighborhood standards. I stared at it in disbelief. I hadn't even noticed any other houses nearby. A second letter arrived the very next day, this one more aggressive. They were demanding payment of fees, claiming that my ownership was contingent upon compliance with HOA regulations. Contingent? I bought the cabin for 50 cents. Contingent on what? My sanity? My ability to decipher bureaucratic nonsense? Curious and maybe a little reckless, I decided to find the HOA president. I drove down the winding dirt path, imagining a sweet elderly lady ready to welcome me to the neighborhood. That was not what I found. She was everything I had feared. Tall, sharp, with glasses perched like binoculars on her nose and a voice that could slice through steel. "You're living in violation of our community standards," she declared as soon as I introduced myself. Her tone carried this smug certainty, like she knew she had all the power in the world. I tried to explain, "I literally bought this cabin for 50 cents. I wasn't aware of any violations." "Oh, you were aware," she said, eyes narrowing, "or at least you should have been." I realized quickly that reasoning with her would be like trying to teach algebra to a cat. She rattled off rules I didn't even know existed: how far my mailbox should be from the road, how many weeds were acceptable in the yard, and a completely arbitrary guideline about how many steps I could take on my porch per day. I'm not kidding. Steps per day. The absurdity of it made me chuckle nervously, but I also felt this creeping dread. Somehow my tiny 50-cent cabin had been noticed, cataloged, and judged long before I even moved in. Whoever had owned this HOA role had an encyclopedic knowledge of every corner of the property, and apparently a sense of ownership that rivaled mine. That night back in the cabin, I tried to calm myself. I was excited about owning property at next to nothing cost, but something wasn't right. The letters kept coming, each one more detailed and threatening than the last. There was no way they were going to let me just enjoy this cabin. I started noticing little things around the property that felt off. Footprints in the dirt that didn't match my own, branches bent as if someone had walked through, and the occasional flicker of light moving between the trees at night. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt eyes on me constantly. I realized then that this wasn't just about rules or fees. The cabin had caught someone's attention, and they weren't planning to let it go easily. The thrill of owning something for 50 cents was quickly turning into a tense game of cat and mouse. And just when I thought things couldn't get any stranger, I found another envelope under the door, thicker than the first. My stomach sank as I pulled it out. Inside was a formal legal notice, claiming the HOA had rights to the property and demanding immediate compliance or else. I stared at the paper, heart racing. 50 cents. My cabin, worthless to me, priceless to them. Suddenly, the stakes felt impossibly high. I realized I wasn't just fighting for a tiny shack in the woods. I was about to be dragged into a battle I didn't even know I'd signed up for. As I looked out the cabin window that night, the shadows of the trees stretching like long fingers across the yard, I knew one thing: the easiest part buying the cabin was over. The real story, the wild, absurd, unbelievable story, was just beginning. After the HOA letters kept piling up, I decided I couldn't spend all my time worrying about them. I had to focus on the cabin itself. I mean, I bought this place for 50 cents, 50 cents. Who even gets the chance to own something like that? I started exploring every nook and cranny, determined to see what I actually had. The first thing I noticed was the attic. It was small, dusty, and smelled like decades of forgotten things, but there was something about it that screamed potential. I climbed the creaky ladder, flashlight in hand, stepping carefully over boards that threatened to give way, and that's when I found it, an old wooden chest tucked into a corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. I hesitated. Part of me thought, don't open it. It could explode or have a raccoon inside or ghosts, but curiosity won. I pulled the lid open and my jaw dropped. Inside were documents, old blueprints, and a folder labeled Property Upgrades and Permits, circa 1987. I started flipping through them, heart pounding. The blueprints revealed something incredible. The cabin had a legal dock on the lake behind it, not just any dock, a substantial structure that could be used for boating or fishing. There were also permits for small renovations that had never been used. Essentially, this cabin was a hidden gem. I paced around the cabin, imagining the possibilities. A private dock, renovation potential. The property was starting to feel less like a 50-cent shack and more like a treasure chest disguised as a rundown cabin. And then I made the mistake of checking the real estate listings. I typed in the address and hit search, expecting to see maybe a few $1,000s. Instead, my eyes widened and I sank into the nearest chair. $10 million, $10 million. My tiny, creaky cabin, the one I bought for 50 cents, was apparently a multi-million-dollar property. I pinched myself, thinking I might be dreaming. But no, the numbers didn't lie. I laughed, then panicked. Laughing about your imminent fortune is easy until you realize someone else might already have their eyes on it. The HOA letters suddenly made a lot more sense. They weren't just nitpicking, they had discovered the cabin's hidden value and were trying to stake a claim before I could cash in. The absurdity of it hit me. Here I was, a complete outsider, holding a cabin worth more than most people's homes in a tiny clearing in the woods, and some HOA president with too much free time was already plotting against me. I could almost picture her sitting in a leather chair, twirling a pen, thinking, we must control this property at all costs. Over the next few days, I began noticing subtle things around the property. Footprints near the dock that didn't match mine, small disturbances in the dirt, shadows moving between the trees at night. It was as if someone or something was checking on me. I started locking doors, even though the cabin was technically empty most of the time, and I double-checked the windows before sleeping. Despite the tension, I couldn't help but imagine what life could be like here. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, the surrounding trees offered privacy and beauty, and the cabin itself, though rundown, had charm that couldn't be faked. I imagined friends coming to visit, a little barbecue by the water, and maybe even some quiet nights reading on the porch. Then I remembered the HOA. Every pleasant thought immediately carried an undertone of dread. If the cabin was worth $10 million, how far would they go to take it from me? I felt a chill. These weren't harmless bureaucrats anymore, they were opponents, and they had experience and resources I didn't. I decided I had to be smart. I couldn't just sit back and enjoy my hidden treasure. I needed a plan, a strategy to protect this property, and if possible, beat the HOA at their own game. For the first time, I realized that owning the cabin wasn't just about having a cheap piece of property, it was about surviving a battle that had already begun. And as I sat on the porch that evening, staring at the lake reflecting the sunset, I felt a mix of excitement, fear, and determination. This cabin had gone from being a laughable 50-cent purchase to the most valuable and dangerous thing I'd ever owned. I didn't know exactly what the HOA would do next, but I knew one thing: they weren't going to get away with this quietly. The fight for my cabin was about to begin, and I had no intention of losing. I had barely finished cleaning the dust off the blueprints when the first official notice arrived. This one wasn't a simple letter tucked under the door. It was a thick envelope with my name printed in bold, a formal HOA seal, and enough paper to crush a small bird. I tore it open, expecting more of the usual fix-your-mailbox nonsense. I was wrong. This time, the HOA was serious. The notice claimed that I had violated multiple rules, including unauthorized occupancy, property boundary infractions, and something called unsanctioned landscaping aesthetics. I stared at the paper, blinking in disbelief. Unsanctioned landscaping aesthetics? I hadn't even planted a single flower. The letter demanded I pay fines, submit compliance forms, and attend a mandatory hearing or face legal action. My stomach dropped. The cabin was supposed to be my escape, my little adventure, and now it felt like I'd accidentally stepped into a courtroom drama I wasn't prepared for. I tried laughing it off at first, imagining the HOA president sitting at her desk with a monocle and a gavel. But the absurdity didn't make me feel better, it made me angrier. Over the next few days, more letters arrived, each one increasingly aggressive. They began to sound almost personal. Your actions demonstrate a lack of respect for community values, one letter read. Another threatened continued noncompliance may result in immediate seizure of property. Seizure of a 50-cent cabin. I pinched myself. Was this real life? I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers, and more importantly, I needed a plan. I spent the day researching HOA rules, scouring old county records, and taking notes on anything that might help me defend myself. Every rule I found seemed ridiculous, but I kept discovering loopholes and technicalities that could work in my favor. That evening, as I sat on the porch reviewing my notes, I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. Shadows slipped between the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the movements were too deliberate, too coordinated. My pulse spiked. Was someone spying on me? Could they be preparing to enforce their threats in person? I decided to get serious. I started documenting everything: letters, dates, even strange occurrences around the cabin. Footprints, bent branches, and flickering lights all logged. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't ignore the sense of being watched. It was as if my 50-cent cabin had become the center of a secret war and I was in the crosshairs. Then came the call. I answered, expecting some bureaucrat to drone on. Instead, the HOA president's voice came through, icy and sharp. "We've noticed activity on your property that violates community standards. You must comply immediately." "Activity? You mean me living here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, you are now under scrutiny, and any further noncompliance will result in action." The line went dead before I could respond. I hung up, feeling a mix of disbelief, fear, and the tiniest spark of defiance. I realized that this wasn't just about ridiculous rules anymore. The cabin had value, and the HOA wasn't going to let me enjoy it without a fight. Every letter, every phone call, every shadowy movement in the woods felt like a reminder they were serious. They wanted control, and I wasn't going to hand it over. That night, I lay in the rickety cabin bed, thinking through my options. The fear was there, yes, but it was mixed with excitement. Somehow, this tiny, crumbling structure had become more than a cabin. It was a battlefield, a test of wit, courage, and patience. and I was determined to win. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the tree line, I could feel eyes on me. The tension was almost tangible, like electricity in the air. My 50-cent cabin worth 10 million was no longer a quiet retreat. It was a prize, and I had just realized how high the stakes were. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself, to the cabin, and maybe even to the universe. I would not let the HOA take this from me. Not now, not ever. Little did I know, the next days would bring the first true showdown, a confrontation that would test everything I thought I knew about property, power, and persistence. But for now, all I could do was brace myself, plan my next moves, and prepare for a fight that I knew was only just beginning. After days of endless letters, veiled threats, and subtle intimidation, I realized something. This wasn't just an annoying HOA, they were gearing up for war. And I had a 50-cent cabin worth $10 million at the center of it. Somehow I had to prepare. Somehow I had to fight back. First, I needed knowledge. I spent hours digging through county records, HOA documents, and property laws. I became obsessed, scribbling notes, printing copies, and making folders with labels like HOA nonsense and proof of ownership. At one point, I even found an old survey map showing the property boundaries clearly marked under my name. I wanted to frame it, but I refrained. Next, I realized I needed allies. I called a friend who was a lawyer, hoping he could make sense of the bureaucratic nightmare. He laughed at first, probably picturing me in some low-budget legal thriller, but then he became serious. "They can't just seize your property without cause," he said. "If you have the paperwork, you're in control, but you need to be meticulous." Meticulous became my new middle name. I began cataloging everything, every letter, every threat, even every strange shadow or footprint outside the cabin. I started keeping a journal of the weird things happening around the property. At night, I would sit by the lake, jotting notes and imagining the HOA president packing in her office, twirling a pen, plotting her next move. I even started preparing the cabin itself. Nothing flashy, just practical. I repaired creaky floorboards, reinforced doors and windows, and cleared brush around the property so I could see anyone approaching. Part of me felt ridiculous, but the other part, the part that had read too many mystery novels, was convinced someone might actually try to sneak onto the land. Humor helped too. I found myself narrating my own little spy story. Agent Me, I called it. On a mission to protect the nation's most valuable 50-cent cabin, I even practiced dramatic lines in the mirror, imagining what I'd say if someone stormed in with a clipboard and a gavel. It made the paranoia a little more fun. Then came the letters, the ones announcing the mandatory HOA hearing. I read the envelope several times. The words practically dripped with menace. Attendance is required. Compliance will be evaluated. Failure to appear may result in action. I felt my stomach knot. They were serious. They weren't bluffing. But I wasn't about to back down. I knew the cabin was legally mine, and I knew I had evidence. What I didn't know yet was how far the HOA would go to intimidate me. The hearing would be the first real test, and I had to be ready for anything: ridiculous arguments, fabricated violations, maybe even theatrics that made me question reality. I spent the night before the hearing packing the cabin. I rehearsed what I would say, imagining the HOA president's smug expression. I even created a list of documents to present: my purchase receipt, the county deed, the old permits, and the survey map. I organized them meticulously, triple-checking that everything was accurate and legible. Somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m., I heard movement outside. Footsteps, a branch snapping. It was impossible to tell. My heart raced, adrenaline pumping. For a second, I imagined the HOA president herself standing in the shadows, ready to confront me in person. I laughed at the thought. Then I remembered people do crazy things over money, and my cabin wasn't just any property, it was worth millions. I sat back down, trying to calm my racing mind. I realized this was more than a fight for a cabin. This was a test of patience, strategy, and nerves. One wrong move and I could lose everything, or at least spend months in legal hell. But for the first time, I also felt a surge of confidence. I had proof, I had preparation, and I had determination. By the time the sun started rising, painting the lake in shades of gold and orange, I felt ready. Whatever the HOA tried next, I would be ready. My 50-cent cabin was no longer just a quirky purchase. It was my fortress, my prize, and my responsibility. And as I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, surveying the property I had fought so hard to secure, I knew one thing for certain. The battle was about to begin, and I wasn't going to let the HOA take it without a fight. The day of the HOA hearing arrived, and I felt a mix of nerves, excitement, and a strange kind of thrill. I kept reminding myself I had every piece of evidence I needed. I had prepared for this. And yet nothing could have prepared me for the sheer intensity of walking into a room full of people who were determined to take my 50-cent cabin away. The community center was quiet when I arrived, but only for a moment. Soon, the room filled with HOA members, all armed with clipboards, binders, and an air of self-importance that could crush small animals. At the head of the table sat the HOA president herself, looking more formidable than ever. I swear she had a pen in her hand that doubled as a gavel. "Welcome," she said, her voice icy. "We're here to discuss the violations regarding your property at 12 Cedar Lane. Please take a seat." I did, taking a deep breath. My pulse was racing, but I reminded myself, this is just paperwork. They don't own the cabin, I do. The president wasted no time. She launched into a list of grievances, reading them with a dramatic flair that made me half expect her to pull a small drum and announce each violation like a grand performance. "Unauthorized occupancy," she said, "unsanctioned landscaping, mailbox placement infractions." I tried not to laugh, it was absurd. But humor only got me so far. I presented my evidence calmly, each document meticulously prepared. The purchase receipt, the county deed, the old permits, and the survey map all lined up like soldiers ready for battle. I watched as her expression changed from smug certainty to confusion, then to disbelief. How did you?" she stammered, clearly not expecting me to be this prepared. I bit back a smile. The room went quiet for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then one of the HOA board members piped up, trying to argue a technicality. I countered calmly, pointing out the legal inconsistencies in their claims. Each time they tried to assert authority, I had a document or a fact ready to rebut them. At one point, the president leaned forward, glaring at me. "You think a few papers change anything?" she demanded. I met her gaze evenly. "No, but they prove who actually owns the property." The rest of the board shuffled papers, muttering under their breath. I could feel the momentum shifting. I wasn't just defending my cabin anymore, I was exposing the absurdity of their entire case. Still, I knew better than to assume victory was guaranteed. The HOA could always appeal, escalate, or try some underhanded tactic. I stayed vigilant, watching every reaction, ready to respond calmly and strategically. Humor helped me stay sane. I imagined this as a game show. Who wants to claim a 50-cent cabin? The audience. A room full of serious-faced HOA members. The prize, my life's adventure. It made me grin despite the tension. Hours passed and the hearing dragged on. Each time they tried a new argument, I had counter-evidence. Each time they raised their voices, I stayed calm, letting logic and documentation speak for themselves. By late afternoon, the room was exhausted and the president looked defeated. Her sharp confidence had cracked, replaced by frustration. Finally, she slammed her binder closed. We will review this," she said, her voice tight, "and get back to you." I didn't need to hear more. I knew I'd won this round. My heart was racing, my hands slightly shaking, but it was a good kind of adrenaline, the kind that comes with standing up for yourself and winning against ridiculous odds. As I stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, I took a deep breath. My cabin, my 50-cent treasure turned $10 million property, was safe for now, but I also knew this wasn't over. The HOA might still try, still plot, still send more letters, and if they did, I would be ready. For the first time, I felt a surge of pride and confidence. I hadn't just bought a cabin, I had discovered a hidden treasure, defended it against absurd bureaucracy, and come out victorious. And yet, the tension lingered. The story wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And somewhere in the shadows, I could feel eyes still watching, waiting for the next move. The real test, the twist I hadn't anticipated, was still ahead. Even after the HOA hearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. The president's defeated glare didn't mean she had given up. She was like a storm cloud, smoldering in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and I knew better than to underestimate her. That night I went back to the cabin, determined to dig deeper into the property's history. I had already spent hours combing through county records, but something told me there was more, something hidden that could turn the entire battle in my favor. I sifted through old files, dusty ledgers, and scanned microfilm like a detective in a noir film. My cat, Mr. Whiskers, looked on as if to say, "You're insane, but I respect it." And then I found it. Buried in an obscure corner of the county archives was a clause, almost invisible in the legal text. It was from decades ago, a condition written in the original property deed. Any transfer or sale of the property supersedes all subsequent association claims unless expressly documented. My heart raced. I read it again and again. That one sentence meant everything. It meant the cabin was mine, legally, unquestionably mine. Every letter, every threat, every intimidation tactic the HOA had tried was invalid. They had no legal claim over the property. None. I couldn't contain my excitement, but I tried to stay calm. I knew the next step was critical. If I presented this clause correctly, it would not only protect the cabin but also turn the tables completely. I began drafting a formal response to the HOA, carefully quoting the clause and attaching copies of the original deed and all supporting documents. Every I dotted, every T crossed. The following day, I submitted my documents via certified mail just to be safe. I imagined the HOA president receiving the package, flipping through the pages, and realizing she had been outmaneuvered. I smirked at the thought. Victory was within reach, but I wasn't letting my guard down yet. Hours later, I received a call. The president's voice trembled, not with authority but with disbelief. This cannot be correct. You have documentation. I do, I said calmly, and it confirms everything. She sputtered, searching for a rebuttal, but nothing came. The silence was satisfying, almost cinematic. I could practically see the gears turning in her mind as she realized she had been thoroughly outmatched. It wasn't over, though. The HOA could still appeal, try to challenge the clause, or attempt some other tactic. But for the first time, I felt a sense of control, a rare feeling in this absurd battle over a cabin that started as a 50-cent whim. I spent the rest of the evening walking the property, thinking about how far I'd come. This cabin had gone from a laughable bargain to a multi-million-dollar prize, and the stakes had been higher than I could have imagined. Every creaky floorboard, every dusty attic, every letter slipped under the door had led to this moment. Humor, of course, crept in again. I imagined the HOA president packing in her office, muttering to herself about that fool who bought a cabin for 50 cents. I imagined her reenacting our confrontation in front of a mirror, practicing lines she would never deliver because she had already lost. It made me laugh quietly to myself, the kind of laugh that mixes relief and disbelief. But there was a lesson buried in all this chaos. Sometimes the biggest victories come from patience, preparation, and a little bit of luck. I hadn't just stumbled onto a valuable property. I had stumbled onto an adventure, a test of wit, courage, and persistence. And now, thanks to that hidden clause, I was in the driver's seat. As night fell, the cabin glowed in the soft light of the moon reflecting off the lake. I sat on the porch, feeling a profound mix of relief, excitement, and cautious optimism. The HOA had no claim, no authority, and no leverage. The cabin was mine, completely, undeniably mine. And yet I knew better than to get too comfortable. Bureaucrats, no matter how defeated, have a way of finding loopholes. But for tonight, I let myself savor the victory, imagining the story I would tell friends. How a 50-cent cabin, a shadowy HOA, and a hidden clause combined to create the most absurd, thrilling, and satisfying adventure of my life. The battle had been won, the war could wait. For now, my cabin and my peace of mind was safe. The days after discovering the hidden clause were surreal. The HOA didn't send any more letters. The president didn't call. It was as if the universe itself had decided to let me enjoy this victory. For the first time since buying the cabin for 50 cents, I could breathe. I spent that first morning sipping coffee on the porch, watching the lake shimmer in the sunlight. I felt a strange mix of relief and triumph. This tiny, creaky cabin had become my fortress, a symbol of persistence, patience, and a little bit of luck. It had started as a joke, a whim, a bargain, and now it was something much bigger. I decided it was time to make the cabin truly mine. I started small, cleaning out decades of dust and grime, fixing the sagging floorboards, and patching the leaky roof. Every repair felt like a personal victory, each hammer strike a statement. This cabin was mine, no HOA, no bureaucrat, no nonsense could take it away. As I worked, neighbors, or at least people I assumed were neighbors, started noticing. Some waved from a distance, others peeked curiously over fences. I imagined the HOA president hearing about my renovations and scowling from wherever she was, muttering, "That fool actually fixed it." That thought made me chuckle. There was humor even in victory. It was my personal touch, a secret joy that made the absurdity of it all worthwhile. I also began imagining how to make the cabin more than a quirky property. A dock by the lake, as the old blueprints had promised. A small garden that actually looked like someone cared about it. Cozy furniture, lights strung across the porch, a hammock swaying in the breeze. Each addition felt like reclaiming the cabin from the chaos and bureaucracy that had tried to claim it. And then, of course, came the financial realization. $10 million. My 50-cent cabin had been transformed overnight, or at least in a year, into a multi-million-dollar property. I imagined the stories I'd tell friends, the disbelief on their faces, the laughter that would follow when I recounted every absurd letter, every threat, every shadowy movement in the woods. But beyond the money, beyond the humor, there was something deeper. The cabin had taught me patience, resilience, and how to stand firm when faced with absurd obstacles. It wasn't just a property, it was a lesson, a story, and a victory rolled into one. I realized that sometimes the simplest things, like a 50-cent cabin in the middle of nowhere, can hold the most incredible adventures. As the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, I lit a small fire on the porch. The light flickered across the cabin, making it glow warmly against the darkening sky. I sat back in a chair, listening to the soft ripple of the lake, the distant call of a bird, and the gentle creak of the cabin settling. Everything felt perfect. I thought back to the day I first drove up that dirt path, imagining a life of solitude and adventure. I never anticipated the battles with the HOA, the late-night shadows, or the absurd legal twists, but I wouldn't trade a single moment. Every challenge had made the victory, every ridiculous letter and threat had made me sharper, and every shadow in the trees had made me cautious and clever. And the best part, my cabin was officially, undeniably mine. No HOA, no disputes, no absurd rules could take it away. I could finally enjoy it, build it, and live in it the way I had imagined. I raised a mug of coffee to the sunset, feeling a sense of accomplishment that went far beyond the financial value of the property. This was about triumph, about proving that persistence, preparation, and a little bit of luck can overcome even the most absurd obstacles. Somewhere in the distance, I imagined the HOA president fuming, her plans thwarted, her authority evaporated. I couldn't help but smile. 50 cents, $10 million, and one epic victory that I would never forget. As night fell, I finally felt at peace. The cabin was quiet, the lake calm, and for the first time in a year, I could simply enjoy the moment. My 50-cent cabin had survived threats, bureaucracy, and absurdity. It had been transformed into something priceless, not just in money, but in story, in adventure, and in triumph. And as I watched the stars reflect on the lake, I knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. My cabin, my victory, my story, it was mine forever. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.